In my view, Dan Rather remained then and remains now a figure of unique stature and unrivaled accomplishments. It was a great pleasure to have him here today, and I ask you to give him an appropriate W&L welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed, for that overly generous introduction, but very much appreciated. Among the things I promised myself I would say here today is that I'm here because Ed Westman asked me to be here. When the heat was on and when a lot of people wouldn't stand up, Ed, whom I did not know, I knew him by reputation, particularly his reputation for teaching integrity-filled journalism and ethics, stood up, stood tall. I haven't forgot it, nor will I forget it, and that's the reason I'm here today. But beyond that, I'm honored to be here and appreciate your invitation to participate in this way. That it's not in me, and I don't think it should be in you, and I don't think it is in you. Before we get started with what our main purpose is here today, not to take part in, if you want to call this an anchorman indulgence, then call it an anchorman indulgence. But as we gather here on this really beautiful Virginia evening, it isn't in us not to pause for a moment to give a thought to the many thousands of our men and women in uniform who are on lonely and dangerous duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I wonder if you could join me in just a brief moment of silence to recognize their contribution and their sacrifice on our behalf. Thank you. Now let's get to work. First, I want to come back to the introduction, which I do deeply appreciate, Ed, but I think everyone in the audience will perhaps have in mind what Robert E. Lee is supposed to have once said about an overly generous introduction. Said the gallant and brave Robert E. Lee about such introductions, never take time to deny it. The audience will find out the truth soon enough for themselves. And so it will be with you. Ed left out one part of my resume, which often gets left out for good reason. The only alleged, even alleged, institution of higher learning from which I carry a diploma is from Sam Houston State Teachers College in Huntsville, Texas. I recognize that many people this far north never heard of the place. Those of us who went there consider it to be the Harvard of our part of the world. Huntsville reminds me somewhat of Lexington. It's smaller than Lexington. When I went to college there, the college was 900 students. The town was about 2,500. And while I'm a proud graduate of Sam Houston, they gave me about all the education I was capable of absorbing at the time, that nobody ever had any illusions about it. It had about as much ivy growing on it as your average Taco Bell or Burger King. It was located, it may interest you, in the poorest part of the state, the eastern part of the state, deep piney woods, and in Walker County. If you haven't heard of that, no embarrassment. Again, I recognize you wouldn't. But the good people of Walker County who are hardworking, it's rural, farm and cattle country. They're great people, and they were great to me. But one of the things they're proudest of is there is not now, nor has there ever been in Walker County, not one single intellectual. Never. And if it's any interest to you, the definition of an intellectual in Walker County is if you can listen to the William Tell Overture and not think of the Lone Ranger, you are an intellectual. I do want to talk about journalism. I think American journalism is in crisis. I want to talk about that some. Particularly want to talk directly to those of you who are practicing journalists, those of you who aspire to be practicing journalists. But while I get myself settled up here, I did an interview just before I came over here, and it took me back to the time when I was in college. As Ed referred to, that football is a blood sport in Texas. Every able-bodied young man, there's no option. You have to play football. I played football in high school, not particularly well, but I played. But I wound up going to Sam Houston State, what is now Sam Houston State Teachers College, hoping for a football scholarship. It didn't work out. I had no other way to stay in school, but a journalism professor, the rightfully legendary Hugh Cunningham, who's still alive in Florida, later went on to the University of Florida. He let me sleep on in his front room while he got me some odd jobs at the college. One of those jobs was at the local radio station. I want to take you back in time now. This is Texas in the 1950s, which wouldn't be that much different from Virginia in the 1950s, and a small town. This was not a college radio station. This was a going commercial enterprise, KSAM, KSAM. It was owned and operated by Pastor Ted Lott, who's now deceased, but to whom I owe a great deal. Hugh Cunningham, my journalism professor, to keep me in school, got me this job at the radio station. This may strike you as strange, and particularly for those of you who are younger, and let's face it, when I speak now, almost everybody is younger. But this was not uncommon in Lexington or Huntsville or any hundred of small towns across the country. Remember, this is a commercial radio station, but Pastor Lott was interested in hiring someone to keep the station on the air Fridays and Saturdays. This station was 250 watts. That was the least power allowed by the Federal Communications Commission for a real commercial radio station. And you had to be on the air from 6 a.m. in the morning to 12 midnight. Pastor Lott, who'd been running the radio station, was eager to get back into his Baptist ministry, so he hired me at 45 cents an hour, which was not bad pay in those days for that kind of job, to keep the station on the air every Saturday and Sunday while he could be out doing the Lord's work. And it was a fairly easy job. I got there before 6 o'clock, flipped the switch, turned the station on the air, kept the station on the air all the way around to midnight. My job was to do that Saturday and Sunday. After the first weekend I worked there, I came in to see Pastor Lott on Monday morning. And I said, Pastor, I don't want you to think I'm unappreciative of this job, but there is one problem. He wheeled around in his swivel chair and said, let me stop you right there, young Dan. He said, if you are here to complain that our wages do not meet the federal minimum wage standard, I'm here to tell you that federal law ain't never applied in East Texas and ain't going to start now. I said to him, no, Pastor, that's not the problem. The problem is, and I explained it to him, I get in here at 6 o'clock and work around to midnight 2 days in a row. You'd be surprised how few places there are open after midnight in a town the size of Huntsville. And by the time about 6 o'clock in the evening comes, I'm ready to eat the carpet or something. He understood. And we worked out the following arrangement. You may think that this story is apocryphal. It isn't. You may say, gosh, I can't believe that happened. But there was a time and place it happened, and I'm here to bear witness to it. The plan was, Pastor Lott understood. He said, okay, here's what we'll do. He said, every Saturday evening at 6 p.m. and every Sunday evening at 6 p.m., you will put on a prepackaged program. Remember, this is well before the digital age. And matter of fact, even videotape hadn't reached Huntsville by that time. This was on an old plastic record about yay size. It was a complete program, a half hour. I was to put the program on at 6 o'clock Saturday and Sunday, hop in the KSAM mobile unit, which was a 1937 Plymouth pickup truck. I was to hustle myself down to the local Dairy Queen on Highway 75, pick up a cheeseburger and a malted milk, get back to the station, and pick up the programming at 6:30. The second weekend I worked at the station. First weekend we tried this, 6 o'clock came, and I put on the record. This particular program featured, no surprise, Pastor Lott's itinerant preacher brother from down at Del Rio, Texas. And the program consisted of Pastor Lott's brother. He did a little Bible quoting, a little hymn singing, a little guitar picking, a little bit of everything on the program. So I put the record on, got it started, hopped in the mobile, went down to the Highway 75, went to the Dairy Queen, and I had a little bit of bad luck there. There was a new freshman girl that I had not had an opportunity to make my acquaintance. And Mary Sue Stramler was her name. So I decided, you know, it doesn't make any difference whether I eat here or eat back in the station. I'll be back in plenty of time before the program's over. So I got my cheeseburger and milkshake, and Mary Sue and I watched the diesel trucks go by on Highway 75. It runs from Houston to Dallas. Always big entertainment in Huntsville to watch the trucks go by. I'd been there about 20 minutes, and the phone rang. Any of you from a small town can relate to this. Everybody in a small town knows everybody else's voice on the phone. Mary Sue put her hand over the phone and she said, Dan, it's Pastor Lott, and he does not sound to be in a very ministerial frame of mind to me. I grabbed the phone for her, and it was true because he was talking through his teeth. He said, young Rather, have you heard our radio station any time in the last 20 minutes? I said, no, Pastor Lott. I told a white lie. There was a long line here at the Dairy Queen, but I have my stuff now. I'm headed back. He said, good, you get back and fix it, and you were fired. Click. I was terrified. Raced out the mobile unit, cranked it up, got on the radio, and there was Pastor Lott's itinerant preacher brother saying, go to hell, go to hell, go to hell, go to hell, go to hell. And he had been saying it for about 20 minutes. Any of you from a small town can relate to what 20 minutes of go to hell on a local radio station will do to your reputation. Fortunately for me, Pastor Lott couldn't find anybody else to work, and he kept me on, and I managed to finish school. Now, one reason for telling you that story is that I'm going to try to cover a fair amount of ground with you here as time allows. But it's really important to me that you understand, that I understand, that what you're looking at here is not anybody of great wisdom. Yes, I've been a few places, been a few miles, but I'm not an expert on anything. You would say, well, you've been in journalism long enough to be an expert on journalism. That's not exactly true. But I'm not an expert on anything. There may be experts on the future of global relationships, maybe experts on what's happening in the cosmos, but if so, you'd be surprised how few of them graduated from Sam Houston State Teachers College. And I hope you'll keep that in mind as we go along. I do want to talk about what I consider to be the crisis in American journalism and why every American should care. I know many of you in this room are already practicing journalists. Some of you in the room are aspiring journalists. I know you take your work and your aspirations seriously. So I hope you'll bear with me as we go through this and you say, gosh, he's pretty serious about that. I am serious about it. I don't take myself seriously, but I do take my work seriously. I feel we need to do so in this case at this time because American journalism is in trouble. And if you believe, as I do, that a free, truly free press, independent, fiercely independent, when necessary, press, is the red beating heart of democracy, then it's not a special plea of journalists when I say journalism is in crisis. It's something every American should care and care deeply about. But consistently I find people saying, well, why should anyone outside of this room really care? Any more than if I were to say that American sitcoms are in trouble, or that American popular music is in trouble, or any of the many other amusements, distractions, or even art carried out by that vast entity called the media. I know there seem to be rhetorical straw men to which you might expect any crowd, journalist or none, to respond dutifully with talk of news being a public service, news perhaps even an essential public service, which I believe it to be. But let's ask the question as if we really mean it, because you can answer a question two kinds of ways, with your lips and with your hips. And too often the value of journalism is given plenty of lip service without anyone making a move to support it. Not owners and operators of news outlets, not the reading, viewing, and listening public, and at times not, though it pains me to say it, we journalists ourselves. Before I go any further, I need to say that I do not exclude myself from this criticism. I very much include myself in this and any critiques that follow. It strikes me that we have a collective choice to make in this country about whether we really mean what we say when we say news is important. And in framing this choice, instead of saying American journalism is in trouble, perhaps we should say, more accurately, American democracy is in trouble, because you cannot separate the two. Our nation's founders put freedom of the press alongside freedom of speech and religion in the very First Amendment of the Constitution, not because they had any particular fondness for newspapers. You can read all sorts of statements by men such as Jefferson about what he considered to be the scurrilous nature of early American journalism. And for the most part, the statements are true. Our early founders did not really like newspapers or newspaper people. No, our founders put freedom of the press at the beginning of the Bill of Rights because they recognized that the free and open exchange of ideas was absolutely essential to a democratic society and a free people, and that they knew that if we, the people, were really going to be entrusted with running the country, then we, the people, had better have access to the facts, to good information on which to base our collective decisions. In this age when we hear so much talk about the, quote, media, I still prefer to say instead the press, where news is concerned, whether it's news in print, on television, radio, or on the internet, because the First Amendment doesn't guarantee, quote, freedom of the media. It says freedom of the press. The press, in my mind, refers to news that has this constitutional mission at its core, no matter what the means by which the news is delivered. The media, on the other hand, is that vast landscape of what is now called, quote, content. Some of it is informative, some of it even looks like news. But the underlying impetus of the media is to entertain, and by entertaining, generate a profit. So with this in mind, we can go on pretending that the news we see today reflects its intended central role in the health of our nation, or we can take a real look in the mirror during which we might see the following: a growing homogenization of traditional news sources, the byproduct of ever more lax government regulations on media ownership, and the rush of conglomerates, not always news or even media conglomerates, to take advantage of these regulations. What is this man talking about? Frame of reference. In the 1950s, there were some 54 to 57 news organizations, print, radio, and television, that were considered to have national distribution, or at the very least, widespread and multi-regional distribution. Well over 50. Today, in terms of national distribution of news, no more than 6, my count is 4, very large international conglomerates control the national distribution of the news that most Americans receive. I submit to you that whether you are a Republican, a Democrat, a Tea Party member, or a mugwump, that this is something to be concerned about. So one of the things is what I call the conglomeratization of the news. My general criticism, both of those of us in the news, consumers of the news, and people who own the outlets. In my lifetime, and indeed the latter part of my lifetime, the news has become, and forgive this, some of these are not even proper English words, the news has become corporatized, politicized, and trivialized. Now, besides this development, there's an unseemly deference in the press to power, which is perhaps to be expected when so many news outlets are owned by very large corporations with manifold interests in Washington, interests that are often at odds with candid reporting. These very large corporations have regulatory interests. They have regulations they want passed in their favor. They have regulations they want stopped to help them their bottom line. They have interest in securing government contracts, everything from defense contracts to infrastructure contracts. They have interests that too often add up to a news philosophy of don't rock the boat, because if our news entity, which is usually a small part of the overall corporate conglomerate, if it rocks the boat, it may affect the widespread profits of the corporation as a whole. Now, another thing has developed. We have reached the point where a forum that pretends to give citizens the world, but instead presents a far too narrow slice of safe and sanctioned ideas, thought, and lines of inquiry, a place that has become an echo chamber for stories generated initially in a precious few places along the Washington-New York axis. Too often, this is what now passes for, quote, news. Also, we've become an institution that, for all of its resources, which have been shrinking dramatically, for all of the hard-won knowledge and day-to-day familiarity that the best journalists bring to the job, our craft is now scared to death to offer almost any independent judgment. Heaven forbid that we should follow up what the president, a senator, a congressman, a governor, or mayor says with some independent fact-based truth squatting, some good old-fashioned vetting of an elected representative's remarks. not when we have available to us the safe route, which is to get someone from an opposing party or ideological camp to present their own competing spin. It's also developed a maddening reluctance to ask the all-important follow-up question of people in high places. Too often, we journalists ask what seems at first like a probing, substantive question. It seems that way. But after an answer that amounts to pure spin, we won't offer a follow-up that has a chance to call the subject on their spin. We're all too happy to play gotcha journalism when it comes to stories of prurient interest, sex scandals, celebrity trials, and the like. But when it comes to matters of true national and worldwide importance, we journalists too often have lost our guts. We need a spine transplant because now we suddenly become polite to the point of ineffectiveness, to the point of providing a megaphone for officially sanctioned propaganda. And speaking of the prurient, who among us will be the first to pledge a moratorium on filling the ever-shrinking news hole with garbage such as round-the-clock coverage of Anna Nicole Smith's drama or whatever's happening to Paris Hilton? Do any of us in this room think that this kind of so-called news is important? Do any of us think that Americans in some way lack other venues for learning about celebrities? I don't mean to sound callous, but in the case of Anna Nicole Smith, and I just picked that case out of one many examples, she was a woman who, by all accounts, and there were many, had a sad life and sadder death. But the day I'll no longer find that coverage odious and beneath us is the day we make room for wall-to-wall coverage of the lives of each soldier killed in the line of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. But given the amount of grief that Ted Koppel received for merely listing the names of the war dead, as he did to his credit, we may not be seeing that anytime soon, which is to say, stories about the lives of soldiers killed in the line of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan that receives anywhere near the kind of play that the celebrity of the day, Lindsay Lohan, whomever, receives. And finally, with the current political season very much in mind, we might see, as we journalists look in the mirror, and as you, the consumers of journalism, look at us, a press that remains transfixed with behind-the-scenes campaign stuff, polls, and the political horse race, while consistently giving the issues and the real behind-the-scenes stories short shift. The biggest story in any modern American political campaign is the money. Who gives how much to whom, expecting to get what? That is the core of what should be reported about campaigns. Remember, I include myself in this criticism. It's what you hear all too seldom. Now, it's true that one reason you hear it all too seldom is in both parties, and even in some of the fringe parties, there's no transparency. If you try to find out in many cases who gave how much to whom, expecting to get what you run into is, sorry, you can't know that information, Mr. Journalist, which means you, Mr. and Ms. Voter, cannot find that information. Now, how many stories did we see at the close of this year's first fundraising quarter on the money race in this off-year election? I would submit to you, not many. And if you think about it, how many stories did you see quoting a poll about who's up this hour or this day, and compare that with the number of stories you saw exposing who gave how much to whom, expecting to get what you're going to see is on the poll list and the horse race coverage, a long list of stories. What you're going to see about the money, other than with very few exceptions, is about yay much. Yet out of all those stories, how many of these pieces delved into just where the money was coming from and why? Of all the stories you've seen, think about it for a second. And will we ever see follow-up pieces after a politician is elected that look at legislation, regulation that he proposed or wanted to stop, and appointments, and connect the dots to campaign contributions? You may see a few of those stories. I'll give you a Texas guarantee you will not see many, if any. I need to say again about this relatively brief catalog of journalistic sins that when I look in the mirror, I see these things too. This is not mere rhetoric on my part. I know specific instances where I've failed on the points I've ticked off. But you are asking, so what do we do? What do I, as a journalist, do about it? Well, we journalists, and now I'm talking directly again to those of you who are in the room who practice journalism and those who aspire to practice it, we need to start with what the coaches call an honest gut check, by asking ourselves if we truly believe our own words about the press, what the press means to this historic democratic experiment we call America. We need to ask ourselves if we still really believe that the American press has a vital role to play as the fourth estate, and that we need to guard our independence in the press and have it guarded by the people at large as fiercely as any governmental entity should define theirs. Do we still believe that for a journalist the truest expression of patriotism lies in asking tough questions of our elected representatives? For it is not the individuals we temporarily raise to elected office to whom we citizens owe our allegiance. No, but rather we owe our allegiance to our country. And it is our inquiry in the press on behalf of the people at large, the society at large, that helps our fellow citizens take proper action on our beloved country's behalf. Do we collectively as Americans still believe in our duty to act, have journalists act as surrogates for readers, viewers, and listeners in the corridors of power? Do we still believe that it's the proper role of journalists to ask the questions that the people at large might ask if they had the opportunity at something such as a White House news conference? Do we, as Americans and as journalists, still believe that there are times when the best question that can be asked of a government official or corporate executive is, with all due respect, sir or madam, will you please answer the question that the other reporter just asked? Happens increasingly seldom these days. Question gets asked, maybe a fairly tough question, probing question. Next person pops up is on a completely different subject. Now, do we believe, and this gets right down to the essence of the foundation of the country, do we believe, do we still believe, do we really believe that ours is a government of, for, and by the people? That all the documents and correspondence of our government rightly belong to we the people? And with the exception of documents of legitimate and current national security importance, these documents should be available to the press and to the people. Particularly when it comes to presidential power, but not only presidential power, it's increasingly difficult to get the papers and documents that will reveal, among other things, who gave how much money to whom and for what purpose. I'm going down my list of rhetorical questions and asking you to turn them over in your mind. Do we still believe that our country is best served when the press remembers that it is supposed to be a watchdog, not a lapdog, not an attack dog, but a watchdog? What does a lapdog do? A lapdog just crawls up in the lap of the power, if you will, in the house or wherever, and just wants to be petted. Nice dog. That's a lapdog reporter. That's a lapdog press. What does an attack dog do? The attack dog goes, you let him off the leash, he goes at the throat of anything and anybody in sight. No, the proper role, one of the most important roles of the press, you learned this in your 7th grade civics class, but too many of us forget it too often. The press is supposed to be part of our integral part of checks and balances. So with a watchdog barks at things that are suspicious. Bark, bark, bark. The watchdog is not always right, but the watchdog barks at things that are suspicious. The watchdog reporter, the watchdog press, goes around knocking on doors saying, rather politely sometimes, what's going on in there? Other times, if it's the 5th trip to the door, what the hell is going on in there? Making telephone calls and asking, insisting, what's happening? What's really happening? Do we believe, do we understand that this is in real peril in the present climate of American journalism and of our beloved country? Now, do we believe, do we journalists, again now I'm talking specifically to the journalists in the agreement, that there is a price to be paid, sometimes a grievous price, when this watchdog falls asleep on the job, and when the watchdog does bark, sometimes there's a grievous price to be paid. Very important for the public to understand that. Do we believe, do we still believe in the importance of international news what used to be called foreign news. In most newsrooms now, they say, no, don't call it foreign news. It's like you don't hear used cars advertised on television anymore. They're pre-owned vehicles. We don't have reruns anymore. We have previously announced programs or something. Well, we have international news. But do we still believe in the importance of international news? Not only news of war and catastrophe, but day-to-day international news that can signal the approach of war and catastrophe, or at the very least provide meaningful context for these things if and when they occur. Do we believe in it enough to push for the reopening of long-shuttered news bureaus around the world? At the very time our country needs more, better, deeper international coverage, we have far, far less of it. We have far less of it because those who own and operate particularly the major national distribution news organs, have found it's much cheaper to do entertainment that is posted as, quote, news. It's much easier, it's much cheaper to get 3 people in a room shouting at one another than it is to finance a bureau in a far-flung place such as Yemen or Brazil or Taipei. Do we still believe it is the press's job, it's the press's role in our society to shine a light on injustice and root out corruption wherever it occurs? And finally, and this I would say, if you don't take anything else from this list, take this. Finally, do we still believe that one of the best definitions of news is something important that the people need to know, that someone somewhere in power doesn't want them to know, and that all the rest is just advertising? Do we still believe that? Make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, I have spent my entire life in commercial news, and I'm not naive. I know that even if there were unanimity among journalists on the above points, it would be difficult to uphold these beliefs without concomitant support from news owners, news publishers, and perhaps most of all, the news-consuming public. But just because we see obstacles to our own best intentions, we as journalists, doesn't mean we shouldn't try to fulfill our beliefs with action. If we truly believe even some of the things I've said this evening, then we understand just how crucial it is for journalists to do their jobs completely and well, and to have the support and understanding of the country as a whole, of you, the people, we, the people. Hopefully, we all also recognize that the further journalists stray from our constitutionally sanctioned role as the press into the, quote, media role of mere content providers, the easier we make it for those who wish to trivialize us, criticize us, sanitize us, and homogenize us. If someone can read, look at, or listen to the news and not perceive the difference between the American press and American entertainment, then we are abdicating piece by vital piece the proper role of the press in a democracy, which is to be part of our intertwined checks and balances. Now, about the public, is there any hope for us here when poll after poll shows that journalists are held in dismally low public regard? Well, my first thought in relation to this is to paraphrase President Truman. If you're a journalist worthy of the name and you want a friend, you better get a dog. My second, more considered thought is news values do not stand, news values as opposed to entertainment values, they don't stand a chance if the public doesn't see journalism not only talking the talk, but also walking the walk. If we journalists want the public to appreciate and support deep, probing, digging journalism, then we need to give good journalism lip service and hip service. We can help our cause by reestablishing a visceral understanding in our fellow citizens that our government is by and for them, and that democracy does not only mean showing up at the polls every 4 years, if that. These things cannot be achieved overnight, nor solely by the press. The press has a role to play in this, And we do owe it to ourselves as journalists to begin this process today, not tomorrow or the next day. Perhaps certain elements of my critique will seem passé to some. A press that fails to question authority, oh, that's so pre-Iraq war, so pre-Katrina, so pre-midterm election. Yes, now we see probing stories about the Iraq war and about the conduct of our government, including engaging in propaganda in the build-up to the war. But could we possibly repeat our mistakes given the right political moment? If your answer is no, then you might ask yourself where, for example, are the stories asking whether Congress has lived up to its promise to effect a wholesale change in rules governing lobbyists? When we talk about who contributes how much money to whom in political campaigns, much of that money goes to the campaigns of the officials. Much of the money goes to lobbyists who do the contact work after the officials get elected. We can't expect the public to see the importance of what journalists do when it comes to reporting on lobbying if we're content just to run with the pack and blow only with the prevailing winds. There is a tendency in journalism, there's always been a tendency, but never in my lifetime has it been as great as it is today, to do the following. You say, listen, jobs are evaporating in journalism. News bureaus overseas are closing. It's really hard to get a job as a young journalist. So if I have a job, the smartest thing for me to do is just move with the herd. Get in the middle of the herd, move with the herd. Don't take a chance. Don't ask a tough question. Don't spend the days and nights and weekends and holidays digging into a corruption story, because you know what? That could be trouble. The president may not like it. The senator may not like it. The congressman may not like it. The governor may not like it. The mayor may not like it. Our big advertisers may not like it. The easiest way is just to move in the middle, move with the herd, and have yourself say to yourself, you know, if I do that, people will like me. The audience will get to know me. I don't cause any trouble. I'm not controversial. So just move with the big mass, and that's the safe way. But we can now see that these probing stories about the Iraq war and about what got us into the war, what really got us into the war, we now see them. What happens the next time? Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, Korea. The world is filled with dangerous places, places that could, let us pray not, could explode into war at almost any moment. Have we learned anything from the Iraq war experience about asking the tough questions, supporting the people who do ask the tough questions, saying, listen, I may not like that guy, that reporter. I don't like his tie. I don't like the way he cuts his hair. I don't like his voice. I don't like the fact he seems impertinent. But I do like the fact that he's asking the tough questions. We in the journalism have not done enough of it. You in the public have not supported that kind of reporting nearly enough. Now, if we wish to instill, we journalists and our fellow citizens, a sense that what we do and how we do it matters to them as much, if not more, than it matters to us, the journalists, we journalists need to fulfill our constitutional mission, not only when doing so incurs no risk on our part, but perhaps especially when telling the truth, airing the facts, and digging below the surface takes daring and nerve. We journalists must not forget that we help to create the expectations and the standards of our news audience. It is my belief and my hope that if we journalists can manage to do this, if we can build back this foundation of consistent integrity and quality, viewers and readers and listeners will come. And if they come, we will have a better chance of getting the resources we need as journalists from our owners and publishers. But if I'm to be honest here, I'm asking more than that from news owners. I'm also asking them to step, to the degree that they are able, outside the realm of quarterly profit statements. Some of you in the audience are old enough to remember, because it hasn't been that long ago. There was a time not too long ago when, yes, let's take a network network television network as an example. Newspapers would be another, magazines would be another. This was part of the mores of the business. We're in business to make money. We're in business to make a profit. But when we come to news, we consider news to be a public trust. And we, the owners of the local station, the local newspaper, whatever, we intend to meet the responsibilities of that trust. News is a public trust. We're citizens of the country. Yes, we're in business. We want to make a profit. We create jobs, all of those good things. But when it comes to news, we want to meet the responsibilities of our trust. And therefore, for at least some wee small part of the business, we're going to view news as in the public interest. And whether it was first CBS and NBC and later ABC, the big network owners who were just as interested in making money as the present owners and operators took the view, we're going to make money, but when it comes to news, we're going to operate news primarily in the public interest. If it makes money, that's fine, but that's not why we're in it. We're in it to meet the responsibilities of public trust, and we view it as a public service. I'm here to bear witness because I've been there, I've been inside the rooms. That is gone. Nobody talks about operating a news operation now in the public interest. If you're working in any very large news operation today, and you go in and say, we want to cover this story, it's going to cost a ton of money, it's going to be controversial, it's going to cause ourselves trouble in Washington, and we want to do it because it's in the public interest, you will either get escorted out of the room or be accused of smoking something very expensive. That the whole idea of public service, of news being a public service operated in the public interest, has just about almost completely disappeared from the scene. Now, I'm not asking owners and publishers to put their money where their beliefs are, because we know these people and know that they are on the whole intelligent, I think well-meaning and well-informed, and so far as I know, they love our country as much as I do and as much as you do. They want the best for the country, and if you ask them, many would tell you, some of them with a great and admirable passion, just how important quality news of integrity is for America. But what holds true for journalists also holds true for those who are entrusted with the ownership of the press, that these sentiments become eroded from within if they are ideals only for convenience. And when these ideals are eroded, we all pay the price, our families, our children, and our grandchildren. I am not advocating charity, but rather a longer view that recognizes that the kind of news that is ultimately compelling, ultimately worthy of the name of news, has a chance to succeed on its own terms, but it cannot sacrifice itself again and again on the altar of entertainment and survive. I do not think the news should be dull, far from it. I just think it should be news. Because if you make news compete on entertainment's turf, which it does almost consistently across the board now, you're not giving it a chance to do what it does best, and you're handicapping it with offering what is available in glut quantities just about everywhere else, that is to say, entertainment. Further, the news cannot rise above the trivial, cannot dig beneath superficial headlines unless it is given the resources to do so. And the most important resource of all may be an owner with guts who will stand behind his or her journalist. My idea of the ideal owner is an owner who has guts, who will not back up and will not back down when the pressure gets on, usually the pressure from some powerful source. I'm aware that some, perhaps most of you, might leave here thinking this evening, well, rather is a crank at best and a fine one to be talking about news values at worst. If that is so, so be it. But I know that my intention is not to rain on anybody's celebration, not to leave a sour taste at a feast. No, my intention is to summon myself and everyone else here to truly reflect on our craft of journalism, which those of us who are in it consider it to be, yes, a calling, to listen to what we say about our mission, and then think about whether we really mean it and whether you, the consumers, are prepared to back it. To ask ourselves, as journalists, if our deeds match our noble words, and to have you, as news consumers, say, do their deeds match their noble words? because American journalism is in trouble and American democracy is in trouble. Some of the damage is self-inflicted, some of it a matter of circumstance, and some of it the result of those whose interests are best served by a weak and docile press. But whoever is to blame for the current state of things, one thing should be exquisitely clear. If things are to be turned around, it is up to us, you, I, everyone else in this room, to start the process. One story, one question, one act of newsroom courage at a time, and backed by a public that understands what's going on. I began this evening with a thought for our men and women in uniform. We never tire, nor should we, of praising them for their sense of duty, for their sacrifices and bravery on behalf of our country. Nor should we. I met a lot of these men and women in a lot of hellholes throughout the world, from Vietnam to Somalia to Afghanistan, Iraq, Central America, and the list goes on. And when you ask them why they do what they do, more often than not, you'll get the answer that it's for us, for America, for the freedoms and flag for which we stand. They actually talk that way. They talk that way because they believe it. So I ask you, journalists and non-journalists alike, as I ask myself, whether we don't owe it to them, to ourselves, and to our fellow citizens to display our own meager measure of courage, to make our own sacrifices on behalf of our country, though they will inevitably fall smaller in size and scope, by exercising the freedom for which they continue to fight, including the freedom of the press. What we journalists are called upon to do, even if we do our best, and what any of us in this room, whatever our craft or profession, is called upon to do, is so little compared to what we ask of them, those who fight daily overseas. But if we still believe in this truly historic democratic experiment, the experiment that says, yes, we can have a united country built on the principles of freedom and democracy, despite the fact, even because of the fact, we are multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. This is a new thing in history. This is what makes America a new thing in history. We're still a very young country. And much of the world believes, listen, you look in the historical context, it won't work. You can't have a country that will stand united, stand together, be free, independent, have a democratic process, and have that much difference in religion, in racial background, in ethnic background. Well, here we are, well over 200 years plus, and the experiment is still going on. But it's by no means certain that it survives, much less thrives, past my lifetime and yours, into our children and our children's children's. If we still believe in this democratic experiment, truly believe in it, then we must recognize that our actions and our inactions can have just as much significance for America as those who are in uniform.